The first iteration of this course began as a new decade opened on January 6, 2020. One of the objectives of this course, which is tied to where it is being taught, has little to do with pedagogy. From the start, one of the goals was to use the opportunity of this course to create an archive that is expected to contain millions of words of commentary on and discussion of the climate crisis. It will be written by literally thousands of college students at the University of California, Santa Barbara, UCSB, throughout the 2020s. In order to have the greatest chance of enduring over time, this material will reside from time to time on the Internet Archive. Before exploring the nature of this unusual course in the archive further, allow me to underscore the importance of this particular 10-year period, as it is not just any decade. As AOC, a representative from New York, famously declared the January before this decade opened, and I quote her here, "The world is going to end in 12 years if we do not address climate change," close quote. Unless you had your head buried in the sand at the time, you know that that she opened herself up to an enormous amount of criticism here. Consequently, regarding this statement, she later made clear that, quote, "You'd have to have the social intelligence of a sea sponge to think that it's literal," close quote. Still, AOC was right to draw attention to the profound importance of this decade, even if she could have done so, well, a little more carefully. Which is, incidentally, exactly what Bernie Sanders, a senator from Vermont, later did when he noted that, quote, "The scientific community is telling us in no uncertain terms that we have less than 11 years to transform our energy system away from fossil fuels to energy efficiency and sustainable energy if we are going to leave this planet healthy and habitable for ourselves and our children, our grandchildren, and future generations." Close quote. The reference to the, quote, scientific community by Sanders was very likely to an October 2018 report from the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, which noted that if we are to, quote, limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, global net human-caused emissions of carbon dioxide would need to fall by 45% from 2010 levels by 2030, close quote. These IPCC findings were also likely what AOC was addressing. So while the world will not literally end in 2030, we really need to have, had decidedly acted by then if we hope, in the words of Sanders, to, quote, leave the planet healthy and habitable for future generations. Consequently, with respect to keeping our planet habitable and welcoming for our species, the decade of the 2020s may well be the most important of the century. But what exactly do people, and young people especially, make of all this? Why focus on the younger generation in particular? Their lives, along with the lives of future generations, will be defined by what we do and fail to do in this decade. For the most part, students in the first class taking part in this project in 2020 were born around the year 2000. 47% were freshmen, 33% sophomores, 11% juniors, 6% seniors, and 3% others, to be specific. Most of them will likely witness the majority of the 20th century unfolding, as will, of course, the 9 classes, following them through the 2020s. Consequently, the climate crisis will be a far bigger issue for this generation than it was for mine, as I have only been minimally impacted by the climate crisis during, my 6 decades on the planet. So what do these young people, with the weight of the world on their shoulders, make of all this? The title of the course, The Climate Crisis, What It Is and What Each of Us Can Do About It, was meant to signal, as best that I could in a few words, what is covered in class. Roughly the first third of the course is taken up with explaining exactly what the climate crisis is and what we can expect in future decades. The second two-thirds is devoted to exploring a range of ways that each of us can make interventions, including personal action, collective activism, becoming politically active, communicating the issue to friends and families, and so on. As lecturer, my job was to inform my students of the situation and suggest ways that each of us can help to mitigate it. In that sense, our respective tasks were clear. I taught, they learned. But in another sense, the more than 800 people in the room taught me a great deal, for which I owe them an enormous debt of thanks. Normally, this would not have been possible with a lecture this large, as traditionally I would have been just broadcasting to the lecture hall with no feedback. However, as I noted, this course employed an unusual variation of a flipped classroom, as students watched and commented on my pre-recorded lectures online. They not only commented on my primary lectures, but also short lectures in which I introduced and framed the course readings and films. All told, they each commented on over 30 short lectures. In addition, and importantly, students are required to spend half their time responding to comments made by their classmates. The idea was to get them talking to each other about specific aspects of the climate crisis and what we can do about it. Some people may see this form of talking as inferior to face-to-face communication. However, having spent a number of years working on facilitating online conference discussions as a more environmentally sound alternative to fly-in events, it's been my experience that meaningful interaction can and does happen online in written form. Moreover, because we have more time to consider our words and be more precise when writing, this form of interaction is some ways potentially superior to spoken conversations. Of course, as a literary historian, I have a certain fondness for the written word. In any event, the primary goal of this course was, one, as the title suggests, to familiarize students with the climate crisis and what actions that we can take to mitigate it, as well as, two, to get them talking about it with each other. All of the material was selected and presented with this two-part goal in mind. However, as with my class discussions, I also learned a great deal. In fact, I learned more than in any other class that I've ever taught, by a long shot. Some of what I learned was pretty pragmatic, as these online conversations taught me, for example, new ways of intervening in the climate crisis, such as specific and novel ways of leveraging and communicating through social media. As you might imagine, my students are far more up on this than I am. But I'm also learning a great deal about how my students think and feel about this crisis. This was not my primary objective in setting up this unusual pedagogical approach, as I did not structure lectures with this outcome in mind. For example, our first reading by David Wallace Wells explores what would happen if we do not limit global temperature rise to 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius, which is the goal of the Paris Agreement. Instead, Wallace Wells outlines the consequences if it creeps to 2 or 3 degrees or beyond. My goal was not to gauge how my students responded to this rather dire consequence that David Wallace Wells lays out. If that had been my objective, I might have provided them with, a questionnaire containing a series of specific questions, perhaps asking them on a scale of 1 to 10 how anxious they were made by the specific discussion of heat deaths in the article. But I'm not a sociologist, and this sort of assessment wasn't my goal. Nonetheless, the online discussions for the article by Wallace Wells, and for all of the readings, films, and lectures for this course, proved utterly fascinating. My students are wonderfully diverse, coming from all over the planet and all sorts of backgrounds. However, they are largely, a collected group with respect to age, as they are, as I noted above, for the most part, all in their late teens or early 20s. They're a particularly bright bunch, as the average UCSB B student had a GPA well over 4.0 in high school. It's also worth noting that they are a largely self-selected group, as only students with at least some interest in the climate crisis would likely take this particular course. Consequently, if you're interested in what bright young people with an interest in the topic thought about the climate crisis in the 2020s, there is much to be learned from this archive. As I plan to, add a new installment each year for the entire decade, presumably what they think will change over the years. For example, the first iteration of the course took place as COVID-19 was initially unfolding, but before social distancing was required. Over 800 students were packed in one room, shoulder to shoulder at the time. Will the next class see the climate crisis differently in light of COVID-19? Perhaps. We'll have to wait and see. Similarly, California's Democratic primary took place during the first class with Bernie Sanders, whose platform centered on a sweeping Green New Deal, taking, an initial lead in that primary. In contrast, the next year the course is taught, either the sitting president was Donald Trump, and a new one, Joe Biden was sworn in. Hence, this political backdrop was significantly different from the first class. It should be interesting to see how these attitudes change. I hope you find this archive useful. The students in this class have already taught me much, and I am more than a little optimistic that I will learn more during the following years. In posting these student reflections and discussion online, my fondest hope is that you will learn from them as well. Okay, so here is the archive, if you scroll down in the book, to the first time that the course was taught, which was in the winter of 2020. And that particular archive has been saved to the Internet Archive. Okay, thank you.